The Cathedral of Sens in France was already full when the funeral procession began. Candles flickered against the stone walls as mourners followed the coffin of one of the wealthiest men in Europe. Nobles filled the aisles while priests chanted prayers for the dead. Inside the casket lay a man everyone believed was dead, but according to a medieval account, something happened during the funeral that left the entire cathedral horrified. A monk stepped forward and addressed the corpse directly. Then, the dead man answered. Some witnesses later claimed the body moved. Others insisted a voice came from inside the coffin itself. And for centuries, people argued over what truly happened that day. Was the man somehow still alive? Was it a miracle, a legend, or something far darker? The monk at the center of the story would become one of the most powerful and feared religious figures of the Middle Ages. Kings sought his counsel. Popes obeyed him. Entire armies marched after hearing him preach. Some believed he performed miracles. Others believed he helped drive Europe into catastrophe. His name was Bernard of Clairvaux. And to understand why medieval Christians believed even the dead responded to him, we first need to understand the terrifying world he came from. Nearly 900 years ago, France was one of the most violent places in Europe. Feudal lords fought private wars across the countryside. Castles burned, bandits roamed the roads. Noble families competed constantly for land, power, and influence. And while the church stood at the center of medieval society, many Christians believed it had become wealthy, political, and corrupt. Into that world, around the year 1090, a boy named Bernard was born into French nobility near Dijon. By every expectation of his class, Bernard should have become a knight, a lord, or perhaps a powerful bishop. He received an elite education, learned Latin, studied scripture, and grew up surrounded by wealth and privilege. But from an early age, something about him seemed different. Medieval accounts describe Bernard as unusually serious, intensely intelligent, and deeply drawn toward religion. While other young noblemen trained for war and courtly life, Bernard became obsessed with prayer, fasting, and the idea of eternal judgment. Then, tragedy struck his family. When Bernard was still young, his mother died. Her death appeared to have affected him profoundly. Later writers claimed the loss pushed Bernard even further toward a life of radical religious devotion. Medieval Christians lived in constant awareness of death, disease, famine, and war. Cemeteries surrounded churches. Public funerals were common. Corpses were prepared in the open. The boundary between daily life and death felt thin. And Bernard became increasingly convinced that most of the world was spiritually asleep. At the time, one of the strictest and most demanding religious movements in Europe had just begun attracting attention: the Cistercians. The monks of the Cistercian order believed Christianity had become too comfortable. They rejected luxury, ornamentation, and political ambition. They lived in isolated monasteries, wore rough habits, slept little, fasted constantly, and devoted themselves to silence, manual labor, and prayer. To many people, the lifestyle seemed unbearable. To Bernard, it seemed perfect. Around the age of 22, Bernard made a decision that shocked his entire family. He abandoned everything, his inheritance, status, and future. And according to medieval accounts, he didn't go alone. Bernard's personality was so powerful that brothers, relatives, friends, and noble companions followed him into the monastery, almost like recruits entering an army. The monastery he entered was called Cîteaux, and life there was brutal. The monks slept briefly, woke in darkness for prayer, ate almost nothing, and worked for hours in silence. The buildings were intentionally plain. There were no luxuries, few decorations, and little comfort of any kind. But Bernard pushed the discipline even further. He fasted so severely that his health began collapsing while he was still young. Later writers described him becoming gaunt and skeletal. His stomach reportedly became so damaged that he could barely tolerate food. Yet the weaker his body became, the greater his reputation seemed to grow. People began seeing him as a man detached from ordinary life, a monk who seemed to exist somewhere between this world and the next. Then, in 1115, Bernard was sent to found a new monastery in a remote valley known as Clairvaux. At the time, it was little more than wilderness. But from that isolated valley, Bernard of Clairvaux would eventually become one of the most influential men in Europe. When Bernard arrived in the valley of Clairvaux, there was almost nothing there. The land was cold, isolated, and covered in dense forest. Medieval writers described it as a place associated with thieves and wild animals. The name itself meant Clear Valley. It was here, far from the centers of power, that Bernard intended to build a monastery devoted to absolute poverty and discipline. At first, the conditions were miserable. The monks slept little, worked constantly, and survived on tiny amounts of food. They cleared trees by hand, built crude structures, and spent long hours praying in silence. And people began noticing. Young noblemen abandoned wealth and privilege to join Clairvaux after hearing Bernard preach. Within only a few years, the monastery exploded in size. Then, something even stranger happened. Bernard's influence escaped the monastery walls. By the 1130s, this ascetic monk living in isolation had somehow become one of the most powerful voices in Europe. Kings requested meetings with him, bishops feared his criticism, and popes depended on him. When disputes erupted inside the church, Bernard was often sent to resolve them. At one point, Europe was thrown into chaos after rival claimants both declared themselves pope. Bernard intervened personally. Traveling across Europe, he rallied rulers behind the candidate he believed was the true pope. Eventually, Bernard's side prevailed. The monk from Clairvaux had helped shape the future of the church itself. But Bernard's growing fame also created enemies. Not everyone admired him. Some believed he had become dangerously powerful. Others feared the emotional force of his preaching. Medieval accounts describe entire crowds breaking into tears while listening to him speak, and Bernard increasingly preached about a terrifying subject: judgment. To Bernard, earthly wealth meant almost nothing. Human life was brief, fragile, and surrounded constantly by death. Again and again, he warned that the rich and powerful would eventually stand helpless before God, which brings us back to the funeral. According to medieval tradition, Bernard attended the funeral of a wealthy nobleman inside the cathedral of Sens. The church was filled with mourners, clergy, and aristocrats honoring the dead man's life and status. Incense drifted through the cathedral while prayers echoed through the stone interior. Then Bernard stepped toward the open coffin. Looking down at the corpse, he reportedly spoke directly to the dead man before the entire crowd. Some versions of the story claim Bernard demanded to know what the man's wealth and power had accomplished for him now that he faced eternity. And then, according to the legend, the corpse responded. Different accounts describe it differently. Some claim the dead man briefly opened his eyes and moved. Others insisted a voice came from the body itself. And some later writers interpreted the story symbolically rather than literally. But the effect on medieval audiences was enormous. The story spread because it perfectly captured the terrifying reputation Bernard had acquired across Europe, a preacher so intense that even the dead seemed to answer him. By this point, many people no longer viewed Bernard as merely a monk. They viewed him almost as a prophet. So, did a dead man actually speak at his own funeral? Probably not. Most historians believe the story associated with Bernard of Clairvaux was a medieval moral legend rather than a literal event. Over time, different versions of the account appeared, each more dramatic than the last. Some claimed the corpse answered Bernard directly. Others said the body moved, and some treated the entire story symbolically. But whether the event happened exactly as described is almost beside the point. The story survived because it captured everything Bernard represented. He lived in a world obsessed with death, a world where disease, famine, war, and sudden violence surrounded everyday life. Churches stood beside graveyards. Funeral processions moved constantly through crowded streets. Nearly everyone expected life to end suddenly and painfully, and Bernard preached with terrifying intensity that wealth, power, beauty, and status would all collapse before death. To him, the wealthy man in the coffin represented every human being. Kings, nobles, bishops, merchants, even Bernard himself, all would eventually become silent before the grave. That message carried unusual weight because Bernard lived exactly as he preached. Born into nobility, he abandoned wealth and comfort to join a harsh monastic order devoted to poverty, discipline, and prayer. He helped transform the struggling Cistercian movement into one of the most powerful religious forces in Europe, founded Clairvaux Abbey, advised kings and popes, preached the Second Crusade, and became one of the most influential churchmen of the Middle Ages. Yet despite his influence, Bernard constantly returned to the same warning: earthly success meant nothing if the soul was unprepared for death. By the time he died in 1153, Bernard of Clairvaux had become one of the most powerful religious figures in Europe. And nearly 900 years later, the story of the funeral still survives because it asks the same disturbing question Bernard asked inside that cathedral. What remains of power, wealth, and ambition once death finally arrived? If you enjoyed this story, please like the video. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe.